Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. Since the October 7th attacks, Beijing has sought to position itself as a Middle East mediator, pressing for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and championing a two-state solution. But in recent weeks, tensions with Israel have flared. Prime Minister Netanyahu accused China of orchestrating an AI-driven information blockade against Israel online. And just days later, an Israeli lawmaker traveled to Taiwan, a move Beijing condemned as a direct violation of its one China policy. In response, China's embassy in Tel Aviv issued a blistering statement warning Knesset member Boaz Toporovsky that his repeated visits to the self-governing island of Taiwan, which Beijing claims as its own, had pushed ties to the edge of collapse. On Netanyahu's accusations, Beijing flatly rejected the charge, calling it baseless, and insisted global criticism of Israel's Gaza offensive cannot be blamed on China. Chinese officials argued that such criticism reflects the international community's call for an immediate ceasefire and humanitarian relief in Gaza, not a coordinated campaign by Beijing. But the war of words comes as Washington pushes for the forced sale of TikTok, underscoring how online platforms have become a new battleground. For Israel, the perception of an AI-driven information blockade highlights the growing role of digital influence in modern conflict and the uneasy place it occupies in China's escalating standoff with the West. For more, joining me now from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He's a fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation. And from Taipei, political risk analyst Ross Feingold. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me. An interesting topic, China, Israel tensions. I mean, two countries that are geographically, geopolitically, religiously, culturally, at quite a distance from each other. Einar, I want to begin with you. I mean, there's this talk that Israel feels there's an AI information blockade going on. Do you feel this is true? Do you share the Israeli view?
I don't know exactly what they mean by an AI blockade. I mean, they produced a lot of the technology that was involved in it. They're working very closely with the U.S., which has all the AI that you need. Microsoft did clamp down on them because they were using information to surveil citizens, and it didn't feel it wanted to be part of that. You know, you've seen the kind of rising tide of international abhorrence at what they perceive as is a Gaza genocide. So I don't know exactly why this would be the issue that they would be talking about as we are on the verge of supposedly a peace plan.
Mm-hmm. Ross, do you share Einar's view?
This is very much an issue in flux. The reality is, from the start of the 21st century, cooperation between Israel and China, especially in the technology space, was growing quite quickly. And at times that made the U.S. government a little angry. But Israel had technology that China wanted. Israel had cash to invest in Chinese technology companies. And that was a very positive relationship for both sides. But again, things seem to be changing more recently, whether that's because of criticism from the U.S. government or because of China's criticism over how Israel is conducting the war against Hamas. But there seems to be some changes recently.
Mm-hmm. So, Einar, you touched on this being an organic reaction in social media versus the Israeli prime minister's view being orchestrated. Do you think that social media is properly reflecting, or at least Chinese social media is properly reflecting what you feel is the organic global view?
Yeah, I mean, it depends where you are. I mean, there are those countries that are far more activist in terms of their view of the Gaza genocide. So from China's perspective, they just see children and women being killed on a daily basis. The abhorrence is huge. But, you don't have armed protests. This is in the United States, yeah. You don't have mass protests that are going on. The social media, it was very clear that the Chinese don't understand this. You have to remember, this is the 80th anniversary of the rape of Nanjing. I mean, 300,000 people in 6 weeks were put to death. Vast majority were civilians. Children were bayoneted. Women were raped and then killed. Unarmed men were used for bayonet practice. So this kind of resonates with them when they see civilians being killed like this in such large numbers without any regard. I mean, when you start hearing doctors talk about children being shot in the head, all right, children. I mean, I'm not even talking 14-year-olds. You're talking about little kids, 6, 5, things like that. This is something that Chinese just don't understand. Why would anybody do that? We, supposedly fought a war 80 years ago against fascism, and it was in essence to take the part of those people, especially Jews, who were being killed. There's 6 million who were killed in these concentration camps, many more displaced. In China, the number was 34 million. That's out of 100 million that were estimated killed during World War II, some directly and others because of famine and et cetera like this. So this is stirring up very bad memories at a time when people are wishing for peace, not more war.
Mm-hmm. So, Ross, where is this coming from then? I mean, there seems to be this understanding.
May I elaborate on that? I actually have a social media account on Chinese social media, and I interact regularly with netizens in China. And certainly they're very angry with Israel and the way Israel has conducted the war. Unfortunately, in my own experience, there's been a loss of nuance. And I'm actually the target, the amount of anti-Semitic comments and content from netizens in China. So I certainly hope that people could discuss the issue. And if people want to criticize the way Netanyahu's government, I think that's certainly something that's open to reasonable conversation and criticism. But I frequently am the target of comments like Hitler didn't finish the job and memes of Nazis and Hitler and Nazi salutes and things like that. So I would encourage people, not just in China, but around the world, if you're angry at Israel and you're angry at Netanyahu's government, there's a way to go about that criticism without resorting to anti-Semitism.
So Einar, Ross says he feels some anti-Semitism when he's on Chinese social media. Do you feel that the Chinese government is doing enough to be able to curb this? Is this something at least they're closely following?
This is one of the popular ideas that somehow the government is curbing all media in China. If people could read Chinese, obviously my colleague can, you can go on to Weibo and you'll find that people freely talk about whatever it is that they feel. And that includes the government. Some of them are not happy, some of them are. The issue is that they do not allow people to get together and start political movements or groups based on issues. This has been poisonous in the United States. And from China's point of view, this is not the way that you conduct an orderly society. Do they listen? Yes, absolutely. The Chinese government is listening. But in terms of curbing anti-Semitic, I completely agree with Russ. There is no room for lumping in all Jews into those who support Zionism. It's a completely different type of thing. I know so many of my good friends who are horrified at what is happening in Gaza. They are horrified by Netanyahu. Even within Israel, you have million people marches in Tel Aviv protesting what they see as a monster and somebody who has extended his stay in politics simply at the misery of others. So, but when you get onto this issue about, I feel hurt and things like that. Well, if you're supporting Netanyahu and you're saying that, this is necessary, this is just defending Israel, that goes beyond the line. And I can understand why people get extremely angry and take that personally. But what my greatest fear is that those radicals pushing this Zionist, what else can you call it, a genocide, uh, are not representative of the Jewish people at large. They're a small minority who have taken control of Israel and are literally the tail wagging the dog of all people on earth. The Jews understand persecution. They understand what fascism does.
Ross, the other interesting issues inside of this bigger issue now. Very recently, a member of Knesset visited Taiwan. I mean, that's generally quite a red line for the Chinese. I mean, was this retaliation? Was this provocation? Was this just an innocent visit?
One thing we have to keep in mind is that parliamentarian countries, whether that's in Europe, US, Japan, Australia, Canada, parliamentarians frequently visit Taiwan. And although China is very angry about those visits, typically that's not something that a government, the executive branch, a prime minister, a president, the government of a country typically cannot control the travel of parliamentarians, a regular occurrence, and they come here and say nice things about Taiwan and they criticize China, and China is very upset about that. But that's not going to change. One thing that's a new development with regard to the Israeli parliamentarians visiting Taiwan is that it seems to be a response to some of the criticism from China with regard to how Israel is conducting the war in Gaza. And Taiwan, which generally aligns its foreign policy with the United States, they're not going to criticize Israel's conduct of the war. Taiwan has made donations to humanitarian aid for Palestinians or for Gazans. It's also made donations to Israel for example, places that were impacted by fighting, whether that was between Hamas and Israel or between Hezbollah and Israel and northern Israel. But Taiwan is not going to criticize Israel. And no surprise, parliamentarians in Israel are saying, well, if China's going to criticize Israel, we'll go to Taiwan where we'll be welcome and we won't be criticized.
So, Einar, is this just a single member of the Knesset acting out, or was he sent there? How does the Chinese government view that visit?
Well, contrary to what Ross is saying, governments do put pressure because these things send signals. From the Chinese point of view, they have been critical of the way the genocide is being conducted. I think most reasonable people around the world are. This idea that, oh, well, they're not going to criticize. I mean, if you see somebody being murdered in the street, you don't stand there and say, oh, gee, I don't want to comment because my friend's friends with them. This is the most juvenile argument that I've ever heard. If you do not believe, if you support Israel and you believe they're conducting some sort of humanitarian operation in Gaza, feel free to say it, but back it up. But this kind of is skirting the edge when I don't know where Russ stands on this in terms of whether he supports Israel in their current actions or not. He doesn't seem to want to say. But the fact is, goes well beyond Gaza. You start looking at the number of journalists that have been killed. There have been more journalists killed in Gaza by the Israelis than the total for the last wars going back to World War II. That should tell the world something. I mean, they're silencing these people. And if you're saying, well, you shouldn't criticize that, or, Israel is free to find fellow travelers who are willing to, not make a comment about the terrible things they're doing, I find that repugnant.
Ross, when we look at these multilateral organizations, especially the ones that China leads or at least is at the head of, like the SCO and BRICS, at least over the past year, they've really firmed up and unified their rhetoric on what's happening in Gaza. Do you feel that's something that China is organizing, that they're trying to use their position on Gaza to be able to have more diplomatic weight in these multilateral organizations?
China already had weight in these organizations, including the ones we often think about, the main ones like the United Nations or the World Trade Organization or the World Health Organization. China has increased its influence significantly in these organizations over the past 2 decades. But when we think about those smaller, but I would say growing in importance multilateral organizations, whether that's BRICS or the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank that's based in Beijing, or regional trade agreements here in Asia, which China is a member of, or the recent summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Of course, China is going to use its influence in those organizations. However, I don't think China is necessarily leading those organizations towards criticism of Israel, because frankly, a lot of the participants in those organizations are equally critical of Israel. So it doesn't really need China to be the engine of that criticism, because so many of those other countries are also critical of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Now, Einar, I'm not a China expert, but I did spend a couple of years there, so I do know China probably better than the average person. And I mean, generally, in my view, when it comes to these types of geopolitical issues, China likes to be a little more reserved, that economic diplomacy more at the forefront. But it seems like this is something that China is taking more of a stand in outside of its just general position, or outside of its general demeanor. Do you agree with that? Is this something that China is a lot more, I shouldn't say ambitious with, but really believes and wants to make a stand on?
I don't like the framing of your question. You're trying to say that China is making a political calculation about the deaths of women and children that everyone sees on a daily basis.
Not a political calculation. Not a political calculation, but inside
I don't know how else to put it.
Let me
push
rephrase
this
it.
idea that somehow this is a power play. It is not a power play. If you can watch what is going on a daily basis, that your television station reports on a daily basis, and say, well, how is this going to work for me? Right? There should be universal revulsion at the deaths of innocent women and children who are being shot in a campaign of genocide. I don't know where that is. I mean, this idea that somehow China is reacting the same way that the U.S. and the Europeans did in their colonial period, when it was just what's good for me, what can I take, and I'll justify it based on religion or whatever. China actually believes that you should have a peaceful world. The SCO, everything that they've done, they're not engaging in wars. They're the ones who are saying, look, we need to talk. We need to stop taking partisan issues. We need to sit down and, through peer pressure and being honest, we need to settle these differences before more people get killed. Mm-hmm. They, unlike the United States, for the last 12 years, China has put $1.3 trillion into the Belt and Road Initiative. They started institutions like the AIIB in conjunction with others. They don't have a veto power there. All right. The new BRICS Development Bank does not have a Chinese veto power. I mean, if you go back to the AIIB, guess who the largest recipient of loans is? India. Right. India is not part of the it's part of the SCO, and BRICS, but it's not necessarily part of the RCEP, and it's not always cooperative with China. So from that perspective, they're trying to play an even-handed game because they believe that that's the only path forward. I mean, the U.S. has a different view. They say, look, the world dominated by the U.S. is the only world that works. So far, that doesn't look like it's a very good equation.
I think you understood me wrong there, though. I mean, look, I'm from Turkey. My country is one of the most vocal regarding what's happening in Gaza. But Turkey's position, or Turkey's style of diplomacy, has always been to be very vocal. I'm just saying this is generally outside of the Chinese comfort zone, the way they're approaching this issue right now. That's all I was asking, but I do want to continue.
Yusuf, I understand what you're saying, but it implies that there's some sort of calculation that China is like, on some things, we're not going to get involved, in other things we are. I mean, there are instances, the Rohingya, I mean, what's happening in Myanmar, things like that, where China has said these are problems that have to be addressed in a certain way. Yes, I agree with that. But this idea that somehow they can hold back judgment and say, we don't want to get involved, we don't want to say anything, when they can see something so obviously happening. I mean, this is not something that can be hidden. The Chinese people wouldn't abide by it, and the Chinese government actually cares. And for them to say, look, we have to say something, that should tell you something. Their former reticence is about how you achieve peace. But once you have a country that goes beyond any kind of rational norms, you have to speak out. Otherwise, in 4 or 5 years from now, when people are taking tally and they're looking back on this, there'll be a litmus test. Where did you stand on this issue? And it's gonna be very similar to what happened to the previous attempts at these kind of fascist regimes. So be aware, you are being judged, if not today, then by history.
Ross, I want to ask you about the China-Iran relationship. I mean, this is obviously something that bothers Israel, having a country as powerful as China with a close relationship with one of its adversaries. How is that perceived right now? Is that, especially after the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, is that something that's greatly concerning to Israel?
Certainly, it's concern to Israel. That's one of the reasons why, as I mentioned earlier, Israel had invested a lot, literally and figuratively, in its relationship with China in the hope that China might trade with Iran and have deep political relationship with Iran, and maybe push back in international organizations on criticism of Iran, for example, over human rights. But of course, Israel had hoped that China would not support Iran's development of missiles or nuclear weapons. So to the extent that China is assisting Iran, or even if it's not the government, if it's private industry that provides dual-use technologies to Iran, that's a legitimate concern for Israel because it is considered an existential threat. And no commentary. I mean, there's nothing we could say on this program. There's nothing the Chinese government could say. There's nothing the Iranian government could say that's going to change the perception in Israel that Iran is an existential threat, and any countries or companies that assist Iran's nuclear or missile development programs are part of the threat to Israel.
Einar, I want to ask you about TikTok. I mean, it looks like it's going to be sold off to a group of people. One of them inside is one of, from what I understand, the biggest donors to the IDF now. The problem with TikTok was originally that the Americans perceived it as a national security threat. Do you see this as a coincidence that it's going to someone who would be very favorable of Israeli narratives?
Well, let's look at the context here. First, Donald Trump was the one who said get rid of it. Then when Biden actually was about to get rid of it, he left the decision to Trump, and Trump says, no, I want to keep it. Well, what happened in the meantime? Donald Trump attributes his election victory to the ability of TikTok to mobilize young voters, an area that he had not done well in before. So he wants to keep it, and he wants to keep it in safe hands. So Larry Ellison is definitely safe hands as the largest contributor, as you were mentioning, in this issue. So yeah, TikTok is just more transactionalism by Donald Trump, paying an enormous amount of money for what is in essence a copycat program to keep kids looking at silly cat videos.
Ross, Einar, we're out of time. I want to thank you guys for a great conversation. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.